All right, well, I am showing 3 p.m., so we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Unmute the Mic webinar on strategies to mitigate rising insurance premiums. I'm Caitlin Snyder, and I have the pleasure of serving as Policy Director at NHNRA. We know that for many of our developer and owner-operator members, rising insurance premiums represent one of the most significant operational and budget challenges that you're facing. So we lined up a really great set of panelists to help you understand the insurance marketplace, as well as how to best position yourself when it comes time for your own renewals. So before we dive into the content, I wanted to remind folks of a few of our upcoming events. So in 2 weeks, we're holding another Unmute the Mic webinar on supporting affordable housing residents and staff in 2021. That'll be at 3 p.m. on February 25th, and that's Eastern time. And during that webinar, we'll cover things like emergency rental assistance, a new program around broadband access, on-site vaccine distribution, and addressing staff burnout. And then a few weeks later, we'll have our annual meeting on March 3rd through 5th. And we've got a really great set of panelists and speakers covering everything from the new 4% floor, tax credit equity markets, changing HUD staff, the latest and greatest in bond transactions, and private activity bond cap management. So registration for both of those events is available on our website, and we hope to virtually see you there. And then for today's webinar, we'll be taking questions both along the way and at the end of the webinar. You can submit the questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and we will address them as they come in. So on to our speakers. Owen Callahan will be moderating today's discussion. Owen is the Executive Vice President and Practice Leader of Property and Casualty at Hayes Companies. He's been in the insurance industry since 1989. I'm not sure he wanted me to say that, but it was in his bio, so I'm going to go with it. And he specializes in real estate, property, and casualty risk insurance, distressed workers' compensation program turnarounds, organizational insurance process development, and the integration of risk management to organizational initiatives geared at reducing total costs of risk, which I suspect will be of interest to many of our members here today. Then we've got Jake Darcy, who is a senior consultant at Philadelphia Insurance Companies, where he is responsible for providing risk management services to clients in the Northeast. He analyzes customer loss activity, assists in the development and implementation of risk management safety programs, and delivers customized service plans targeted at key loss exposures, which again, I suspect will be of interest to our members. And then last but not least, we've got Jeff Green, who is the Vice President for Administration at Preservation Management Incorporated, which is a national property management firm specializing in affordable multifamily properties. He oversees corporate risk management, safety, human resources management, and facilities support functions. So as I mentioned, we've got a really great set of speakers with a lot of knowledge to share with all of you. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Owen, to get us started.
Great, Caitlin, thank you very much. And thank you to all the participants that are joining us today for our discussion. We were talking a little bit earlier before things got started about the number of participants that are actually logging on to this. And we were joking in not so funny of a way, but joking that the topic for today has obviously been of import to a lot of people in your industry and other industries. So the purpose of today is really to take a look forward and to understand first in my role as the insurance broker and a risk management consultant to explain the marketplace. As Caitlin just said, our other speakers, we felt that having a broker perspective was important to kind of give background on the market. But importantly as well, on our panel, we also have Jeff, as Caitlin mentioned, as a client and as a buyer of a large property management firm. You can see some of that information here for Jeff's firm, as well as Jake with Philadelphia Insurance, who is a key player in this marketplace and has been for some time. So they certainly have familiarity with the marketplace. Jake obviously on the loss control side, not on the underwriting side of the house. So a good, what we felt, cross-section of panel to address most of the issues that are taking place. And that you as either buyers or users of insurance would want to know in this rising market. So without further ado, what I thought I would do is walk through the marketplace itself right now and give kind of a broad brush view of what's happening. I'll work kind of on a clockwise basis here on this particular slide. You probably all saw the market starting to make some changes at the end of the fourth quarter in 2019. Catastrophic losses in the property market were continuing to manifest themselves, whether it be the Australian wildfires, the wildfires that we had domestically on the West Coast, flooding, tornadoes. All of that was really forcing the property market's hand, as well as the liability. We'll talk a little bit about the liability market as well. What you may have lovingly heard as nuclear verdicts, and I'll touch upon that a bit. Those types of verdicts started to continue to rise from 17 through 18 and into 19 and into today, driving a hardness of the market on the liability side. So not only, we talk about a firming market. When we talk about a firming market, what we mean from a technical perspective is that prices are rising. When we start to talk about a hard market, a true hard market, which we really haven't seen in 30 plus years, a hard market is when you start to see across the board pricing increases coupled with vast reductions in capacity. So those of you with larger portfolios that may have layered programs, you saw impact on your layered programs. For those of you with large towers of excess and umbrella, 50, 75, 100 million in tower, maybe more, you saw those towers start to fracture. You may have had those towers structured in 5 carriers, and now they could be 10 to 15 carriers. So that loss activity and that severity, and what we call, what we've referred to now as the frequency of severity, was driving the market. Enter the first part of 2020, and we had the onset of COVID-19, which presented a vast amount of exposures that were quite literally unseen. That COVID-19 impact, as we all know, continued to have economic impact through 2020, driving down both consumer and business confidence. That lower confidence then impacted really the ability of the insurance market to grow on an organic basis, meaning in a rising economy, there's more payroll, there's more revenue, there's more assets. Premiums tend to rise in an organic manner for the insurance carriers. That was absolutely absent, especially with COVID and furloughs and reduced revenues, reduced payrolls, et cetera. You couple that with the current economic environment. People will tend to say the insurance carriers are making tons of money in the stock market because they reflect on their own personal 401ks. The fact of the matter is that, and most of you on this phone call probably know, that the insurance carriers themselves, they're not invested in the broad stock market. They're invested in bonds and interest-bearing tools. So with the lower interest rate environment, that actually took carrier profitability downward. The losses were driving loss ratios. So it was somewhat of a perfect storm where loss ratios were increasing, investment income was decreasing, organic growth was decreasing. And what that created was this hard market that we face today, extending into 2021, likely through and into 2022. These factors really do play into the fact that this will be more of a sustained hard market and not one that you see coming and going as we've seen, say, in past economic cycles, whereby in 2008 in the economic meltdown, the market hardened and then softened right back up again. The same in the wake of 9/11. There was a momentary, what we'll call momentary, hard market for a matter of months. This market seems to be sustainable. Broad terms here, just in terms of the overall insurance marketplace, severity trends are up. You probably may have seen these in your own portfolio, but the severity trends are up significantly when it comes to casualty. I mentioned what I call nuclear verdicts. For those of you running your real estate portfolios, what you've seen historically perhaps is a slip and fall, bad slip and fall. You might be able to settle for $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. Those same slip and falls in today's marketplace with today's juries. You might also hear the term social inflation. We're seeing epic jury verdicts. That same $300,000 slip and fall is now possibly 1.3, 1.5 million or more. These types of verdicts then pierce your typical per occurrence limit of $1 million and tap directly into the umbrella. Historically, the umbrellas haven't really been touched with any level of frequency. The difference in today's market is that the umbrella market is being touched with frequency. And so what you're seeing now from a casualty perspective is the insurance marketplace starting to take a look at what their return on capital is, and they are charging more aggressively for the use of their capital to insure clients' losses. So a lot of that has been really driven by not only historical losses, but also these jury verdicts that are just simply epic. On the lower right, you can see the industry combined ratio, which we had 3 years of a softer market in which they were making money. Investment income was good, but you can see 16, 17, 18, 19, all adverse loss ratios. And coupled with that adverse loss ratio, you've got adverse interest income as well, which is just exacerbating the overall marketplace. Again, social jury verdicts, expected rate pressure from 2019, we're expecting at least, with the final numbers, a number excess of 104%. You can see on the lower left of this slide, the general liability combined loss ratio is projecting to continue to go up. Underwriters, and part of what we're going to be talking about today is what can you do to offset this? So one of the things that underwriters are more focused on is our more esoteric things that used to just kind of go by the wayside. What does that mean? Well, they're looking at your contracts. You know, what do you have for contracts out there where you are actively pushing risk and transferring your risk to a third party? That might be contractors that you're vetting, contractors that you are using. They want to ensure that where you can transfer risk, you are doing so. And Jeff will speak a little bit about that as well. Conversely, the underwriters want to know, where are you accepting risk contractually? That is becoming more and more of a heavily scrutinized area. We'll get into a few other areas where underwriters are scrutinizing your submissions that are being sent to them a little bit more firmly as well. Specific to affordable housing and the portfolios that you all are dealing with, we talked about investment income shrinkage, organic growth shrinkage, loss ratio. What that's tended to do for you as a market, as an industry, if you would, is that the number of carriers writing has shrunk. So the natural law and supply and demand curve is in full effect right now, where you've got fewer carriers writing it, they're charging more for their capital, and that's also driving the market. Standard line carriers that we have seen in the past have chosen to exit the market or taken more stringent approaches to their underwriting, which has forced more and more clients into the excess and surplus lines market. Naturally, when you enter the excess and surplus lines market, there are higher rates to be paid, whether that be on a per door basis for casualty, a higher minimum per million, rate per million on excess, or a higher rate per 100 on your property segment. Additionally, that excess and surplus lines market will naturally drive significantly higher deductibles. Most oftentimes we were seeing very low, if not zero deductibles in the standard market. Those are steadily disappearing, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Those of you with smaller portfolios, what we might deem 1,000 units or less, You may not be seeing this broad impact right now. If you are not a national player and you're tied to a region or a smaller geographic footprint, you may still be able to play with a more regional carrier that has a regional appetite for your business. That's fantastic. That's an exceptional place to be as a buyer, because you're lagging the broader marketplace. What those of you in that scenario should be aware of is that this marketplace exists surrounding these regional carriers. It's important for you to recognize that all of these carriers are buying from the same reinsurance market. As you know, a lot of these carriers will take on a portion of the risk, but then they will reinsure above that risk. And that reinsurance market is quite small. There is some new excess, or I should say some new capacity coming into that market, but that market is hardening and firming as well. And that's also driving the retail market. So these regional carriers are also suffering from higher reinsurance rates, and that will get passed down to you as well. So just be cognizant of that. For those with 1,000 units or more, or you are spread throughout a very wide geographic territory where a single regional carrier cannot accommodate your exposure, you're seeing the type of marketplace that I am describing here. You're probably familiar with it, because as we sit here in February of 2021, you probably have already suffered some form of increase or decreased capacity in 2020, if not at the tail end of 2019. What to be aware of as this market continues to harden. We're starting to see, and this is in place as well for the regional carriers, but what we're starting to see is a pullback on terms and conditions, a function of a hardening market, where even 2 years ago, a year and a half ago even, we would easily get exclusionary language associated with assault and battery to be eliminated. That is no longer the case. We have hard and fast assault and battery exclusions coming onto the policy. So if you're working in tougher jurisdictions, or you have what you might call a tougher portfolio with your Section 8 housing in a tough jurisdiction, those violent crimes that you might be tending to get defense on when you're brought into such a scenario, we're starting to see those defense protections fade away. Abuse and molestation, the same. Firearms, animals, all of those are being excluded in the current marketplace. Materials, as I say here, chromated copper, so pressure treated materials, starting to see exclusionary language on that. Pull cords, swimming pools, those types of scenarios will start to immediately eliminate potential carriers out of the pool of carriers that you might have access to, or that your broker might have access to. And then construction and some subcontractors, we're seeing very limited language, meaning that you must vet those subcontractors. You must have a certificate on file that demonstrates a certain limit that those subcontractors are carrying. Absent that, you are taking that carrier out of play if you cannot provide that as part of your overall approach to risk management. Other things, a little bit heavy on the GL here, but that tends to be an area. We're going to talk some about property, but crime studies. So for those of you with national or regional portfolios, be aware of what your region and or what your various jurisdictions are looking like for crime studies, because that is an area that is being heavily scrutinized by the underwriters. I know for us as a brokerage house, when this started to happen, we started to proactively run crime scores on tougher zip codes so that we understood what the underwriters were looking at. As an informed buyer, you too will want to understand, hey, I know that my zip codes in a certain area of my portfolio are tougher, but you should really understand what that crime score looks like, because you are being judged against it by the underwriters. REACT scores from HUD, as most of you may know, scores are dropping. We are in the midst of COVID. Those visitations and inspections have become a little bit more limited. But prior to COVID, those scores were dropping, and the underwriters are using that to scrutinize on their underwriting file. Because of the reduced capacity and the number of markets, keep in mind that all of these things, the crime scores, REACT scores, what this is actually a technical term in the insurance industry, judicial hellholes. Who would have thought? But these are things that the underwriters are looking at. And as the market shrinks in terms of the number of carriers playing in this space, what you have to consider is that the number of submissions that they are getting are very large, so they can be very picky. So it's important that you as buyers are aware of all of these things so that you can bring whatever controls that you can into play, and so that you have an awareness of what those underwriters are looking at. Property, I probably don't have to speak too much about this, as most of you have probably experienced this. Again, I'll say a more regionalized portfolio may have been a bit more insulated from this dynamic, but these dynamics are happening. I talked about underwriter scrutiny. The premium increases are going up demonstrably. I say 10 to 25% here. I'll be honest, when I put this slide together, I was being a bit kind. We are seeing increases that are higher than that. Again, depending on the makeup and composition of the portfolio. Property valuations. Historically, on a big blanket schedule, there's been, the ability to skew the per square footage replacement cost down. If you should be insured at 150 to 175 or 130 to 150 per square foot replacement cost, you may have been able to get away with 100 to 105, maybe 90. Those days are over with underwriter scrutiny. They're going through the portfolios, they're understanding the construction, they're scrutinizing the construction, scrutinizing the protections that are in place, and they are assessing their own values. We've seen multiple carriers take strident action on portfolios that has driven the premium for the property placement. And then that increase in total insured values has then been further exacerbated by a rate increase. So the insurance carriers are doubling down in this area. And again, it's somewhat a product of their loss ratio, and it's also a product of what is happening in the reinsurance market, which is why whether you are a large portfolio or a regional portfolio, these dynamics are very much in play. I mentioned that the capacity in terms of the number of players in the market is shrinking. That's on the casualty side. It's also on the property side. Just carriers are starting to walk away, especially if there's jurisdictions, say in what I would call catastrophic prone areas. We here in Massachusetts, I sit in Boston, the North Shore of Boston, the North Shore of Massachusetts. There are times where I think that our underwriters are modeling us as if we were in Miami, but that is what is happening with the models that are being published now and the models that are being updated ever since Superstorm Sandy. And then just the demand from the underwriters about data. Again, this gets into underwriting scrutiny, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of what can you be doing to take control. You can start to take control. We'll talk about this in more detail, but you can start taking control by looking at your statement of values or having your finance department or whoever it is that is in charge of this really taking a look at your statement of values, scrutinizing it yourself so that you have an understanding of where you are before an underwriter sees it, because you might be able to take some corrective action. I talked a little bit about umbrella and that marketplace. Again, the umbrella marketplace is being touched by a frequency of severity. So it's no longer frequency and severity, it is a frequency of severity. Again, nuclear verdicts, the umbrellas are being tapped into repeatedly. That umbrella market is now shrinking. If you have a $50 million tower of cover, you may have been able 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we could have one carrier step in and put up 50 million of cover. That slowly dwindled to 2 carriers at 25 million apiece. In today's market, a $50 million tower, you could see 5 carriers on that, taking up maybe only 10 million apiece. And your rate per million is very, very high for the first 10, not just the first 5. So you can see at the bottom of this particular slide, 60% of casualty claim payments are exceeding $1 million. That's from Liberty Mutual. Now that's across the board. It's not subject to strictly housing liability and general liability. But what that tells you is that the insurance carriers themselves, in a broad basis, are seeing this frequency of severity themselves. And if 6 out of 10 are piercing the $1 million per occurrence limit, you can draw your own conclusions about how the umbrella market feels about that. Workers' compensation, I honestly never thought I would hear these words come out of my own mouth, but workers' compensation has actually been the bright spot in this particular marketplace. Workers' compensation has continued to be, I would say, stable, if not soft. But in a preview of coming attractions, we can expect that market as well to start to firm up. The COVID pandemic still has a story to tell relative to workers' compensation. Those of you with portfolios and workers' compensation exposures in California know all too well, and there are some other jurisdictions as well, but Governor Newsom in California has really taken the lead on this relative to COVID-19 and the ability to drop the hurdle, drop the burden of proof of where you caught COVID-19. So in California, that's been a very tough market for workers' comp. So that kind of tail of the pandemic, tail meaning TAIL, the longevity, the liability that we still have yet to see from workers' compensation and the impact of COVID-19 will start to put pressure on the workers' compensation market in broad strokes. So again, something for all of you to be aware of relative to that marketplace as well. In terms of the overall market, there's not a lot of good news, right? So the market is driving activity to you. It's driving your rate. It's driving your terms and conditions. You can control your portfolio to a certain extent, but the marketplace is exerting pressure upon you. So part of what we wanted to talk about today, with the backdrop of why the market is the way it is, and what the market is doing, is how can you as purchasers of insurance, users of insurance, and being involved in the buying decision, how is it that you can take better control? I'm going to turn this over to Jake in a second here, but essentially what Jake and what Jeff would talk to you about is selling yourself to the marketplace, being in lockstep with your broker, and driving information to your broker so that they can drive your best work and explain and sell you to the marketplace. One of those areas that you can focus on and take control is with loss control. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Jake from Philadelphia Insurance.
Thank you, Owen. My name is Jake Darcy. I'm a risk consultant with Philadelphia Insurance, located in the Boston area. I work with a lot of habitational accounts with Hayes Companies and some of our other partner carriers. So what I was hoping to do today was give you some insight on what we're seeing as the major loss exposures for habitational and affordable housing, and give you some information and tools to help combat these exposures. Year after year, these continue to be the leading loss exposures that we're seeing. Fire claims being the leading loss driver by severity, with the primary causes of fires being cooking, electrical, and smoking. Then slips, trips, and falls being the frequency driver, especially in cold weather climates this time of year with the snow and ice exposure. And then we see water damage claims, both in cold weather climates due to pipe freezes, as well as just other types of unintended water release accidental sprinkler system discharge. And then weather continues to be a major contributor to the property exposure, whether due to wind and hail. And finally, crime, assaults and shootings, which can be a problematic exposure in some of the neighborhoods where these affordable housing properties are located, as Owen had mentioned. So diving into the cooking fire prevention, we've seen this continue to be a major exposure. So there has been an increase of equipment and items on the market to help combat this exposure. Smart burners being one device. These types of burners would replace the heating elements on an electric stovetop. And these devices are intended to limit the total temperature of the cooking surface so that cooking oils can't reach high enough temperature to actually ignite and start a fire. Then you see things such as knob control devices. Some of these are restrictor plates that would limit the temperature that the resident can actually turn the stove on, as well as child activation restrictors when you have stove knobs that are located near the front of the oven. There's been a lot more of automatic shutoff devices. These devices can range from equipment that requires you to hit a button after so many minutes to actually keep the cooking surface on, as well as temperature monitoring, and even some motion sensing devices where if the device senses that nobody's been in the kitchen, there's been no movement for a period of time, it will actually automatically shut the oven off. And then one potentially no cost option that a lot of organizations I work with have been taking is just resident education. Some organizations will put posters on the inside of the kitchen cabinets, flyers throughout the hallways, and then if there is any type of resident service coordinator, hosting meetings to discuss safety topics with the actual residents. And then when you can't prevent every cooking fire, the backup is the suppression devices. These devices, commonly known as fire stop cans, or Auto Out is the company that we've partnered with, are a form of fire suppression that are installed above the range. And these devices activate when an actual fire lights a wick on the bottom of the device. Each can is about the size of 2 hockey pucks, and they're a very cost-effective way to limit the cooking fire exposure for your properties. This is one thing that underwriting has really been looking for as of late, as we continue to see a lot of cooking fires. And even in sprinklered buildings, this is an excellent resource because in theory, these devices will extinguish the fire before the sprinkler system is activated, preventing that extensive water damage that occurs when you do have a sprinkler system activation. So very easy to install. These devices can oftentimes just be magnetically installed to the top of the hood. There are also systems in place if you have a microwave located above the stove. In their 6-year product life, you don't need to have a professional inspect them like you would with a fire extinguisher. You basically just set it and hope that you never have to use it. But if it does go off, then hopefully it's limiting the potential damage from a fire. And one key thing to note about these devices, if you do currently have them installed throughout your properties, is that the positioning and the installation of devices is critical. They need to be centered, 2 devices per range centered in between the burners, because if they're not installed properly, there is potential for the fire to spread and activate the sprinklers before the device actually is activated and serves its purpose. Other potential fire exposures that we see are related to electrical fires, as well as smoking. Federal Pacific breakers and aluminum wiring are always red flags for our underwriters. So those are definitely things that, as you do look to improve and invest money into your properties, that may be worth addressing. One thing I would definitely know is if you do any type of aluminum wire remediation, maintain that documentation, because that is one thing that our underwriters definitely like to know and like to have proof that the aluminum wiring has been remediated. And then if you do have any concerns about the electrical systems on your properties, you can always reach out to an infrared electrical contractor to do an infrared assessment of the property. And what that's going to do is show you any potential hotspots throughout the system, areas where there's a potential deficiency due to overloads or connections that need replacement. And that's one excellent preventative maintenance method to help potentially prevent any electrical fires. And then resident smoking can definitely be a challenge. I'm here in Boston, and most of the properties I look at are smoke-free. But even smoke-free properties, you're going to have tenants that are smoking, and it can be very difficult to enforce. So having a clear policy in place is critical. Most people know if you go to a hotel and it's non-smoking and you smoke, they're going to charge you, $250, $500. Your residents should know that there's a clear policy with some type of disciplinary action in place for smoking inside the building, whether that is a cleaning fee or a lease violation that could potentially result in eviction. There are smoking residue testing kits available on the market, and just having those kits can be enough to potentially dissuade the tenants from smoking, knowing that you're serious about testing and that there is some type of disciplinary action as a result of smoking inside the building. So moving on to the slip, trip, and fall exposure, having regular inspections of all walking surfaces, making sure that sidewalks and parking lots and any walking surfaces are well maintained is really critical. You don't want to be in a situation where there's a clear and obvious hazard and an individual takes advantage of that. Documentation is key. I always recommend keeping snow and sweep logs, documenting every time plowing and shoveling and salt and sanding occurred, so that in the event of an incident, you can show that your organization was doing your due diligence in trying to control that potential exposure. And then maintaining detailed incident reports if an incident does happen, and keeping those on record. Oftentimes we'll see a slip, trip, and fall claim come in, a few days before the statute of limitations is up, because that individual is hoping that you don't have any documentation of that incident when it actually occurred. So keeping documentation, as well as having adequate risk transfer controls in place. As Owen mentioned earlier, underwriting is looking more into your contract language. So having a strong contract in place with a snow removal company or a janitorial company can help protect you in the event of an incident by transferring the risk to that contractor. And then there are some items on the market that can also help with this exposure. It's winter up here in in New England, and we've got snow and ice on the streets and sidewalks. So more organizations are utilizing these ice alert signs. They actually change color to notify you when temperatures drop below freezing. So one method to alert your residents of potential freezing temperatures and potential ice, as well as another way to show that your organization is doing everything they can to combat this exposure. As well as radiant heating options for exterior walking surfaces. These can be incorporated into design plans. Having radiant heat on your stairways is an excellent way to make sure that you're not going to have ice formation on those stairways. But then they do also have temporary heating mats on the market that can be used in a pinch as well. And then the last item I wanted to touch on here are window control opening devices. Unfortunately, I have worked with some organizations that have had tragic incidents of children falling from windows. So anytime I look at a habitational building, we always want to make sure that they're addressing this exposure and that window control opening devices are installed for any tenants that do have young children, as well as in any common areas where children could be potentially access. Newer windows do have these devices built in, but if you don't have them, there's a number of products on the market, and they can be relatively inexpensive. And the majority of these products are HUD compliant, where you're not going to be blocking a means of egress because these devices can be easily removed in the event of an emergency. HUD's stance has really been that they would rather see these devices in place to protect children than taking a hard stance in terms of the egress component. Water damage prevention has been a major topic for us. It's especially on the forefront this time of year with freezing temperatures. We mentioned the infrared cameras for the electrical system reviews. Infrared cameras can also be utilized to identify freeze-prone areas of your buildings, as well as water infiltration. An infrared camera can detect, moisture in a wall or a ceiling if you are concerned that there may be some leaks. And then if it's a really cold day, you can easily utilize an infrared camera to see where the drafts in your building are and where there is potentially areas that may have missing insulation that could potentially lead to a pipe freeze. So there's a wide variety of these cameras on the market. This image on the right is a FLIR 1 camera. This is what I have and utilize for my property surveys. And these things run about $300 and they connect right to your smartphone. So a handy device to have if you do have a number of buildings and you want to get a sense of, where the most freeze-prone areas might be. There's also water flow monitoring and auto shutoff devices on the market. These devices are pretty nifty in terms of actually sensing how much water your building regularly uses, and then being able to automatically shut off the water supply if there is an excessive water flow. So this is a good way to combat potential water damage due to overflows from toilets or bathtubs, and just a great way to, further protect those areas of the building. And then there's also a number of low temperature and leak detection devices on the market. We actually recently rolled out a program providing these devices to our customers for free. We've branded the program Philly Sense, but these devices are available through Hartford Steam Boiler. And what you do is strategically position these devices throughout your building in areas that may be prone to freezing temperatures or just unintended water release. And if the device comes into contact with water or drops below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, this will immediately notify you on a smartphone app. And then if the temperature actually drops below 45 degrees, there's a 24/7 monitoring service where someone will call you and let you know that you have freezing temperatures in your building. So just another way of monitoring, hopefully getting ahead of the issue before there is a pipe freeze, or being able to shut off the water supply before water damage is extensive. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on some of the security controls on the market and methods that organizations are taking to really combat this exposure. There's the obvious resources, you know, having good access control for your buildings and your properties, whether that's, you know, a key fob system or having a gated property, having appropriate lighting so that the property is well lit and you don't have hidden areas on the property, having an extensive camera system, as well as security alarms. They're all going to help with the security exposure, and they all look good when it comes to underwriting, reviewing the organization. Additional controls, security guards can always be handy, and we've talked a little bit about the risk transfer controls. This is an excellent way to transfer that risk to another organization, as well as having a good relationship with your local police department. Oftentimes that can be a very significant impact, just having the local police patrol the property once a day or once at night. Other tools that I've seen, go back here, that have helped combat this exposure is just having good communication with the residents. Some organizations I've worked with have set up a suspicious activity hotline so that residents can report any suspicious activity they see on property. Could be as minor as graffiti or as serious as an active shooter on site. And then paired with that are mass notification systems. Alert Media is one that I've seen gain popularity with organizations I work with. But being able to notify all of your residents in the event of an active shooter event or a dangerous individual on property, just anything you can do to help combat the potential crime exposure, and also show that the organization is doing all that they can to really help combat this exposure. That is all I wanted to touch on today. So I will turn it back over to you, Owen.
Jake, thank you very much. So we left off by turning over to Jake about concentrating on loss control. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you guys can use this for your benefit with renewals. So we'll transition to the top of this particular slide. And the first thing is about starting your process early, your own self-scrutinization, and the reevaluation of coverages and what's important. It used to be that you could start a renewal 90 days out and be comfortable in terms of getting your information in front of the underwriter and having the underwriter review it and have a proposal come back in a timely manner. Again, for your industry sector, the reduced number of carriers that are writing in the space, generally speaking, these underwriters are inundated with submissions. So the underwriters are being very careful about what they are underwriting. So with that file load on their desk, we highly recommend that you're starting your process 4 to 6 months before the renewal date. It almost will feel as though you put the renewal to bed and are taking it back out again. I know that that's how a lot of our clients feel. But the fact of the matter is it's absolutely necessary to start that process. Part of that process in terms of starting early are the meetings with your broker and potentially with carriers, and I'll get into that in a moment. But for you to be part of developing that submission, again, you want to be in a position where you are selling yourself to the marketplace. So when you look at your statement of values, go through your replacement cost valuations, because the insurance underwriters are absolutely going to do that. There is one question I just wanted to kind of maybe touch upon here. I noticed in the Q&A that related interest rates in terms of the impact that might have on the underwriters assessing replacement cost value. I may not have fully understood the question, but my response to it from what I can see is that the interest rate environment might be driving the real estate market itself relative to perhaps market pricing of real estate. But keep in mind that what the underwriters are looking at is not so much market value of the property. They're looking at the replacement cost of the property. And replacement costs over the years have steadily increased. Again, supply and demand. The demand for building materials on new construction. If any of you look around in any of the urban areas, I know I drive into downtown Boston and I count no less than 13 cranes in the skyline. So the demand for building material and labor is high. That is driving increased replacement costs per square foot. So the interest rate environment doesn't necessarily have impact on the underwriter's scrutiny of the replacement cost. I hope that I at least tried to answer that question. Other things for you to consider in terms of the submission and what you are talking to your broker about. And if your broker's not asking these questions, then this gives you the platform to drive information to them to ensure that your voice is being heard by the underwriters. But talk about the capital expenditures that you've made perhaps throughout the last 12 months. Roofing improvements might be one. Any one of the number of tools that Jake just described would be another. Fire stops, what have you. If you have planned capital expenditures for the upcoming year, talk about those, because that forward-looking statement will be welcome by the underwriters. It will help to differentiate you amongst the 120 other submissions that might be on their desk for March 1st. Completed loss control recommendations. Oftentimes loss control, all due respect to Jake, he'll spend time at our clients. He'll send out a very detailed report with loss control recommendations. It will take 6 to 8 months to get those responses back in terms of what's been done on those loss control recommendations. The underwriters in today's marketplace will look at that. Have we put out loss control recommendations? Have we gotten feedback to those loss control recommendations? So those of you with upcoming renewals that have loss control recommendation reports on your desk, or perhaps your operations officer's desk, your facilities guy's desk, ensure that those are done. They're done well. If you can't answer one or meet one, at least maybe put in place a plan to describe how you might address it in the future. Highlight everything that you've been doing from a loss prevention and safety perspective. I just mentioned looking out the windshield, putting together your plan and describing what your long-term CapEx improvement plan looks like. I talked about some of the things that you can do relative to your own knowledge. Understanding perhaps in working with your broker to understand what your catastrophic picture looks like throughout your portfolio. Flood maps have changed. If you have not seen a flood map in the past 5 years, I guarantee you that if you are on the edge of a floodplain 5 to 6 years ago, you may be in that floodplain now, or a lot closer than you thought you were. The underwriters will look at that. It's important for you to understand that as well in terms of understanding your own portfolio and what the cat risks look like associated with it. We talked a little bit about non-insurance risk transfer. Again, these are the contracts that you are signing where you are accepting risk from others in terms of making another party, an additional insured on your policy? Conversely, where can you be transferring risk away to perhaps a tradesperson, making sure that you're getting additional insured status from your electrical contractor, HVAC, plumbing, etc. Once that submission is really tight and robust and telling a good story of you, ask for, if you haven't had one, ask for an underwriter meeting, meet them, develop a relationship. Some of our longest term relationships with clients and with carriers come because the underwriter knows the buyer. And we as the broker are facilitating that relationship. We are not afraid to be in the middle of that relationship and have those two parties know each other directly. It's important, especially in today's marketplace, because they want to hear from you. Obviously, with COVID, there's not a lot of site visits, but doing these Zoom calls with your underwriter, if you've never met them, now is as good a time as any for you to develop that relationship and initiate that relationship. And again, focus of the meeting should be on selling yourself. What have you done to reduce your risk, either from a property exposure perspective, we talked about the fire stops and whatnot, all the way through casualty. When a loss control person walks onto your property, are the paved sidewalks cracked with large gaps that would promote a slip and fall? These are the first things that these underwriters will see through the loss control reports. So you want to make sure that you're presenting yourself in the most advantageous light possible. Renewal structures. Again, this might vary dependent upon a smaller, say, regional portfolio versus a national portfolio. On a national basis, master programs have been kind of the rule. We've seen a lot of consolidation of master programs, putting everything together, big TIVs, etc. These have driven fantastic results over the years, but now as underwriters pull back on capacity, these master programs may be more and more difficult to support. We've seen various programs in the industry splinter and come apart in these kind of buyer cooperative programs as a function of losses crushing a particular carrier and or the lead carrier in that program, and then the program kind of splinters apart as a result of that. Looking at the regional insurance markets, again, those regional markets may have a better appetite. So for those with a national program, do you look at regionalizing the portfolio? It may, in fact, as an option, become less expensive overall than maintaining the big TIV within a single carrier, within a single master program. We've also seen the approach where taking smaller portfolios and breaking them off into smaller, again, BOPs, business owner policies. We have to think differently now as a result of the marketplace, but what we have seen in certain instances where the fit is correct is that this BOP approach with a master umbrella sitting above it might be the most cost-effective approach. And again, that might be more for the smaller portfolios with regionals, but the larger portfolios might have a bigger problem being able to sustain that type of an approach to the marketplace. With larger programs, obviously large deductible programs or getting larger deductible programs, taking on more risk. So again, working with the finance department to understand what the market is doing to you and what your appetite for risk is. $100,000 deductibles, or moving from a deductible to a pure self-insured retention, using fronted policies to meet lender requirements. We've seen that. We've started to see and structure aggregate deductibles where we'll have a program where the client will take, regardless of the per loss amount, the client will take simply the first $1 million of claim activity. And once in totality that $1 million has been reached, the insurer steps in and pays for losses excess of that $1 million. Again, that $1 million could be made up of $25,000 claims, $50,000 claims. It's simply an aggregate deductible, and or a function of the two in terms of these larger programs. Doing so, playing with the risk corridor, may invite on these larger programs other carriers to the table because they are willing to play with a client that is willing to take a larger amount of skin in the game. And at times, that's what we have to do is determine what is the value proposition to the marketplace, whereby we can expand the universe of carriers that we are inviting to the table to work on our client. Because in today's marketplace, that is the name of the game, is how do you get more carriers to the table to quote on your business. What I'll do now is I'll turn it over to Jeff, who is a buyer, very astute buyer, and he can speak to more of, from a client-centric perspective, some of the things that he has done.
Okay, thank you, Owen. My mission today is going to be to talk about some of the things we're doing on the ground to prevent losses and mitigate risks. And for us, it really starts with building a top to bottom focus on safety and risk management throughout the organization. We're, as I think it was noted earlier, we manage, 100 or so properties in 20 states, and we have about 450 employees. We are not going to be able to significantly impact on risk or risk mitigation or safety if we're trying to do that from the corporate office in South Portland, Maine. It has to involve everybody. We have to engage all of our employees everywhere in this process. So the way we do that is, first of all, we have a corporate safety steering committee. It consists of leaders from across the organization. It meets every month and it reviews incident report data, workplace injury data. It reviews the root cause analysis reports and recommendations I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So there's a bunch of information. There's a lot of information that comes before that committee at their monthly meetings, keeps them on top of what the situation is throughout the organization, and enables them to really drive that focus on safety and risk mitigation that I talked about. In addition to that, at all of our work sites, there's a monthly safety meeting. All employees are required to attend at every work site across the country. There's an agenda for that meeting that will include the safety topic of the month, training and information on whatever the topic is for that month. But importantly, these meetings also provide a forum for employees at the local work sites to identify any risks that they see at their or safety hazards that they see in the at their work site in terms of the conditions or the procedures that are being used at their work site. That all gets documented so that corporately we can follow up on those things and make sure that they get addressed. So again, we're trying to build a top to bottom focus on loss prevention and safety throughout the organization and to engage everybody in it. Some of the specific things that we're doing by way of fire prevention, Jake talked about fire stops, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. We do have fire stops installed at all of our properties. The thing to know about that from the standpoint of a property manager is that you have to, there's some overhead and some administration associated with these things. They can walk away residents can move them. They can be tampered with. So, and they do have expiration dates. So you have to manage those devices. We do quarterly unit inspections. We look at them every month to make sure they're there, that they're properly placed. I mean, every inspection, every quarterly inspection. We're checking them. Corporately, we track expiration dates. So we know when a property is going to need to replace their fire stops next year. And when the budgets are being done for next year, we make sure that information gets to the people that are preparing the budget for that property. We do have no smoking policies at virtually all of our properties. That is a lease addendum. We do enforce it as a lease requirement. And we're finding increasingly that non-smokers are increasingly sensitive to people smoking where they're not supposed to be smoking. And so we get lots of reports when it happens. People let us know and we follow up on it. One of the things that we've just started doing by way of educating residents in this area of fire safety, we now have a certification that is reviewed with every resident and signed by every resident when they move in, and each year at their annual recertification, it gets reviewed and signed again. And that certification deals primarily with the issue of cooking safety, because that's the source of most fires. And it's basic guidelines, basic do's and don'ts. You know, stay in the kitchen when you're frying, broiling, grilling, or boiling. Never leave the apartment while you're cooking. If you don't cook when you're sleepy, or have consumed alcohol, never allow yourself to fall asleep while you're cooking. I mean, basic things like this. There's information in this certification about the fire stops. And there's a notice in here that failure to comply with these guidelines creates a safety hazard, which would be considered a serious lease violation. So we're trying to keep this issue in front of residents and not only educate them, but get them to understand the seriousness of this. In terms of, and we do prohibit, as I think probably most multifamily properties do, supplemental heat sources. That also is in the lease. We have the terms of slips and falls and our initiatives to mitigate that risk. We do have the temperature signage that Jake referred to. We do daily walkarounds at every property just to do a visual inspection and to look for any hazards that may exist. We do monthly property inspections that are more in depth and involve a formal checklist where we're looking, among other things, for risks and safety hazards. Snow and ice removal policies for parking areas. This is something that we're beginning to focus on more. One of the things we're learning is that it's important to be clear about what the property's responsibility is for clearing snow and ice and what the residents' responsibility may be. For example, if the deal is that the plow plows the driveway and residents are responsible for removing the snow around their car, it's important to formalize that. Everybody may understand that that's the deal, but it is important to really formalize those kinds of things, because that's where the slips and falls happen. We find is people clearing snow, or in many cases, that's where it happens. And in order to really determine where the liability lies for that, it's important to have formalized whose responsibility it was to clear that snow and to make that area safe. In terms of crime prevention, this is, Owen talked about this some and Jake did too. We are making increased use of electronic surveillance. We have security, human security at some properties too. But we are making wider and wider use of electronic surveillance. We find that it's a good deterrent because obviously the surveillance is there looking at the whole property 24/7. No human security can do that. And people are aware that whatever they do is going to be recorded. So it does help to deter criminal activity. One of the things we've really begun to focus on lately is firearms and weapons and the rules around that. We have very strict rules regarding firearms and weapons in our lease. And those rules apply not only to residents, but they apply to any visitors or guests, whether those visitors or guests are invited or not. The rules prohibit carrying firearms in any common area of the property, period. And again, they apply to guests. We actually, to the extent that we had a situation not too long ago where, an associate of a boyfriend came on the property with a gun looking for his associate. The boyfriend wasn't in the apartment at the time, but the resident was, and this person ended up shooting that resident. And we initiated eviction proceedings. We terminated the lease of that resident because their guest had come on the property and violated the firearms policy. So that's how serious we are about it. Again, we have a certification that we put in front of residents when they move in. We have them sign it. We review it with them and have them sign it again every year when we do the recertification. And this certification reminds the resident of the prohibition against carrying or displaying weapons or firearms in any common area of the property. It reminds them of the fact that it applies not only to them, but to their residents and guests, or to their guests and visitors. And it makes them aware that violations of these rules are material lease violations and will result in termination of the lease. So again, we're trying to educate residents and also make sure they understand that we're serious about this. Contractual mitigation, risk mitigation, I think is an increasing challenge for all of us. We do have insurance agreements and insurance requirements in our management agreements. Our owners all carry liability insurance. That insurance is primary. We have contingent liability coverage. We have strong contractor indemnification language and insurance requirements in the contracts that we use with all of our contractors. And Owen talked about the importance of this a little bit as a way of transferring liability and risk. One of the things that we find, here's a real world issue, very often contractor has their own contract form that they want to use. And they're not willing to sign our contract form. And that's fine. We have a terms and conditions document. It's an attachment to that contractor's contract form. It would be signed by us and them. It contains our indemnity and insurance requirements. And it starts out with the language that says, this is intended to be a supplement to the contract, and to the extent of any inconsistencies with the contract, these terms and conditions will control. And it's important to do that because one of the things we're finding is that contractors are getting very good at transferring risk. I've seen some incredible things in contractor contracts and in their insurance policies. We've seen contracts in the security industry. This is particularly prevalent, where the indemnity language essentially says we're responsible for anything we do. we're responsible for anything they do, and we're responsible for anything anybody else does. And by the way, if they are found to be responsible for anything, the limit of their liability is $2,000. So those are the kinds of provisions we're seeing in some contracts. It's important to review these things. We're also finding it's important to review the insurance policies themselves, owner insurance policies and contractor insurance policies. We literally had a situation not too long ago. We had a snow plowing contractor whose insurance policy specifically excluded coverage for snow plowing. So increasingly, it's not enough just to get the certificate of insurance. We need to also look at the policy. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about this. I think by far the most important thing that we are doing is this continuous improvement process that we've established. It starts with a robust incident reporting system. We get incident reports about anything that happens at any property. I review all of those, the CEO reviews all of those, and there's a group of people that look at every one. And then I and our risk manager meet with whoever was involved in that incident. If it was an employee injury, it would be the employee and their supervisor. If it's something else, it would be whoever has knowledge of that incident. And we drill down into it. And this applies to any incident, no matter how minor they are. We drill down, and the primary purpose is not to blame anybody for anything, but to learn what happened, why it happened, and what we need to do to make sure it can't ever happen again. And we've learned, what I've found is that when you do this in an organized way, you learn things almost every time that you wouldn't have otherwise known. We talked about fire stops. A really good example lately that occurred lately. We noticed that we had a couple of cooking fires at a particular property. And for whatever reason, those fires were not put out by the fire cans and ended up triggering the sprinkler system. And the fire damage ended up being minor, fairly minor. But of course, these things always happen on the 6th floor, and the water damage ended up being significant. It resulted in a significant loss. So we wanted to understand why this happened. And we called in consultants, and one of the people we called in to help us with this was Jake, who spoke a minute ago from Philly. And Jake, he actually conducted a virtual inspection of the units at this particular property, and was able to determine that in most of the units at this property, the fire stops had been moved to a location that would make them ineffective. And the reason that they had been moved, we think, is because the configuration of the hoods, the range hoods in this particular property was such that when the fire stops were in the proper location, they were visible. And, people may have seen it as somewhat of an eyesore. So they moved them out of the way so that they wouldn't be visible. But that also made them ineffective. So we've now dealt with that, and we've conducted inspections at every one of our properties that has fire stops to make sure we don't have this same situation in other places, or if we do, that we get it corrected. So that's an example of the kind of thing that you learn when you do these investigations. We had a situation just last week. We noticed we had a number of slips and falls that had occurred at a particular property. And so we dug into that a little bit and learned that at that property, the contract for snow removal did not make the contractor responsible for inspecting for ice regularly and treating any ice that might develop. He was just responsible for coming and plowing when it snowed. He only came to treat ice. The deal was he came to treat ice the property called and requested it, which, when there's no staff on site during the weekend or at night, for example. So that left a huge gap in our coverage of the problem of snow and ice at this property. So these are the kinds of things you learn in the process of doing this work. So the last thing I want to just say is that it has been important to us. I want to emphasize the importance of partnering with your insurance carrier. Owen mentioned this too. It's helpful, I think, in both directions. Jake has been to a lot of our properties. He's been to our annual conference and met with all of our property managers and done educational sessions for them. So that's been helpful to us. He's also been helpful to us in visiting some of our properties and identifying risks for us that we've been able to mitigate. But hopefully that partnership also enables his company, he and his company, to learn about us. And hopefully that puts us in a better place when it comes time to renew our insurance policies. So I am out of time. I will stop there, and thank you very much.
So Jeff, thank you very much. And Jake, thank you as well. I think we'll turn it back over to Caitlin or Brooke to close us out and entertain any questions that might be out there.
Sure. So thank you all. You did a great job. I'm getting some background noise. Here we go. We've got a lot of questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them in the next 9 minutes, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. And whatever we don't get to, we will follow up via email. You've also got the panelist contact information there if you have a specific question that we weren't able to get to. So we'll start from the top. What are some of the best practices in the risk transfer to security companies? We know about specific contractual language surrounding no exclusions for assault and battery. Is there anything else you recommend?
Jake, I don't know if you want to take that from a contractual risk transfer, or Jeff, if you've done that with any security companies. I know for us, it's a matter of our clients obviously vetting the security company, understanding their background and what their personnel looks like, and then vetting the personnel that will actually be on site at their specific locations, in addition to all of the what I'd say is the normal contractual risk transfer back to that security company, especially if you're going to be talking about say armed security versus non-armed security. Jeff, do you have anything to add to that, or Jake?
Oh, for us, it's that contractual risk transfer that's important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just, sending over a copy of the contract to underwriting so we can always take a look at it.
And there was a recommendation earlier around having police patrol the property on a regular basis. And there's a question here about any specific recommendations about using local off-duty PD as security. Good idea, bad idea, risk transfer ideas?
We do some of that. I would say that it's a case by case thing. That really depends on the location, whether that works and whether that's a good idea or not. What we do try to do everywhere is make sure that we establish a relationship with the police department. And we do everything we can to help them do their jobs. And we hope that in return, that they will be responsive to our needs.
All right, moving on to the next one. There was talk before about pull cords, and they're asking what are some alternatives to those, such as Life Alert or other similar systems?
Sure, I can take that. Our stance is we don't require that a property actually has emergency pull cords, but if they do have the pull cords, we require that they're monitored 24/7, because there have been instances where an individual pulled the pull cord, it wasn't tied to a monitoring station, nobody responded to the emergency, and now there's that potential for pain and suffering. So we typically recommend that if there are pull cords, they're tied into either the central station fire panel or the burglar alarm panel, so that there is an immediate response. One way around that is having someone on site, like an on-site caretaker, where they're going to be notified. There are systems where it can connect to a cellular number. So if the pull cord is activated, it would call somebody. Other properties have taken the approach where they're actually providing the life alert system so that they can get around that as well. But we have seen organizations where it's too expensive to tie the system into their central station monitoring, so they actually remove the system entirely because they weren't required to have it by the local code.
Yeah, we have those systems at a number of our properties, and this is another one of those things that's kind of site specific. It depends on what you have in place to start with. What you need to do to replace it or make it work effectively.
And there's a couple of questions here about a fire safety guidelines or certification that one of you mentioned. So we will get that from Jeff and put that in the follow-up materials. And there's been a lot of questions about, will this be recorded and the materials available? Yes, we'll send that all out tomorrow afternoon. Then moving down, so this is about the gun limitations and the firearms. So having a resident sign a statement that they're responsible for firearm violations by visitors isn't necessarily going to help when they are of low or moderate income, essentially judgment proof. And the property has big insurance limits. And so the question is, does this really help with insurance and liability?
Well, we hope it helps to the extent of preventing, sensitizing people to the issue that if you've got a guest or a visitor, or you yourself are inclined to take a gun with you on the property to display or carry a gun on the property, that you'll think twice about that because it will cost you your housing.
Sure. So perhaps more of a deterrent than anything else.
That's right. Yep.
All right, moving on down. Do you have a risk management department that tracks and drives these efforts? And Jeff, I think this one's directed to you.
Yeah, we have a one-person risk management department.
You're looking at him?
Well, no, there's one other person. She works for me. We actually have somebody who has the title of risk manager, and she works with me. So it's basically the two of us. But as I said, the key to this is you get everybody engaged in it.
And this is another one directed to you. How do you handle indemnification on elevator contracts? Do you utilize a master vendor agreement for all of your vendors? This is one of those places, it's been several years since we've done this, so I'm stretching my memory here. We have really just two elevator maintenance companies that we deal with. So we do have master agreements with both of them, and those are on the elevator company's form. And this is one of those places where the contractor has tremendous leverage and you have very little.
Yeah.
So you do the best you can to build reasonable indemnity language into those agreements, but it's very difficult. You just don't have a lot of leverage. It's like the insurance industry, just aren't many places to go.
That's right.
So I'm going to try to get to a few more, but I recognize that we've only got a minute left. What set of crime data and level, be it tract, zip code, county, are you using to assess risk?
Well, I'll go ahead. I know we use the Prometrics data available through ISO, and it's just the national database, and you basically enter in an address and it gives you the crime score on a scale of 1 to 10, 5 being average, 10 being the highest crime area. And then it actually breaks that report down into different categories, such as burglaries, homicides, etc.
And you can also, there's other tools out there such as CoreLogic, and you can run those at a zip code. I think part of the question was, do you run them at a zip code level? I mean, so that's appropriate.
And then Jake, going back to some of the systems you were talking about, are there ROI studies out there that assess, how much these systems cost to install versus what they're saving on the insurance side of things?
I'll have to look into that. I know a lot of these are just more of a kind of qualitative tool, like the fire stops, for example, where it's hard to gauge how much money is potentially saved with those, but they definitely look good for our underwriters, and it is something that can help with your insurance rates at a minimum.
Yeah, and just real quick, unlike, I think I tried to answer the question in chat, but unlike auto insurance, where if you invest in a car alarm, you get a 2% discount on your personal auto, there isn't that linear connection between the investment in fire stops or any of the other, say, water suppression systems that Jake talked about, where the underwriter is going to give you a specific credit for doing X, such that you invest X and you get Y back. You might have various products that tout that, but in reality, the underwriters are not, there's no linear connection there. But what the underwriters will look at is a more qualitative approach and say, yeah, they've done this. I like them better than the next submission on my desk, which is not doing this. Because at least now I can have confidence that if there is a fire, I have a higher probability as an underwriter not to pay out a max loss on a fire because you've invested that. So, not the answer that anybody wants, of course, but.
I think it speaks to it's a complex calculation that is hard to just whittle down to this gets you this, that it's
Correct.
Everything in the aggregate.
That's correct.
Well, we are past our time and we have far more questions here than we will be able to get to. So to the extent that these were submitted as not anonymous questions, we will attempt to follow up with folks, but also you've got their contact info. So I encourage our attendees to follow up with Jake and Jeff and Owen on their own. But I want to say a big thank you to the three of you today. I thought this was a really informative panel, and as evidenced by the questions that we've received, this is a hot topic for a lot of people and a source of pain. So they're looking for solutions, and we hope that this has been helpful for all of you. So thank you all for attending and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks everybody for attending. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Jeff, Jake, thank you.